What's the worst thing you can imagine happening on a flight? Samantha Green smirked as she looked down at the young boy sitting in the first-class seat. Amari Johnson, the 7-year-old son of billionaire Lucius Johnson, had been quietly reading a comic book when Samantha passed by with her tray. He was used to flying private jets, but this time, his father had decided to take a commercial flight for the sake of experience. Amari, not yet fully understanding the complexity of wealth, simply sat there, a little nervous but otherwise calm. Samantha, on the other hand, was clearly not impressed. In her eyes, Amari was nothing more than a spoiled kid, someone she could easily dismiss. With her years of experience as a stewardess, she'd encountered all kinds of people. But the rich ones, especially children, always got on her nerves. They thought they could buy respect. Amari's polite request for a glass of water was met with a sharp, dismissive glance. "Water? Is that all?" she muttered under her breath, rolling her eyes as she turned back down the aisle. Amari didn't hear her. He was too busy flipping through his comic book. But Samantha's sneer didn't go unnoticed by the other passengers. As she walked by again, she couldn't help but make one last remark, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Spoiled brat," she muttered, her voice thick with disdain. Her words cut through the air, drawing uncomfortable glances from nearby passengers. But Amari remained unfazed. He had been raised to ignore people who tried to belittle him. However, what Samantha didn't know was that Amari wasn't just any child. He wasn't the kind of boy who would simply let an insult slide. As the flight continued, the tension in the air grew thicker, though none of the passengers knew why. Then, a phone call came in. Lucius Johnson's deep voice echoed through the cabin, and Samantha froze when she heard his words. "Is my son okay?" Lucius's voice was calm but firm. He had an air of authority that could command anyone's attention. "Is he being treated well?" Samantha felt her heart race. She wasn't prepared for this. As she glanced nervously at the child, she realized her mistake. Amari wasn't just some rich kid. He was Lucius Johnson's son. The billion-dollar empire, the man who controlled industries and had the world at his feet, was his father. The same Lucius Johnson who could make a single phone call and have anyone fired. "Yes, sir. Everything is fine," Samantha lied, her voice trembling. She could feel the weight of the situation shift dramatically. A few moments later, she received the call she had been dreading. "Samantha Green, I've been informed of your behavior. You and your entire team are terminated, effective immediately," the voice on the other end of the line said. Samantha's stomach dropped as her worst fears became reality. She could feel the eyes of the other flight attendants on her, but none of them dared speak up. They all knew that Lucius Johnson's word was final. "I'm sorry, sir. It was a mistake," Samantha stammered, but it was too late. Lucius had already made his decision. Her career, along with the team that had been with her, was now over. Samantha had underestimated the wrong person. Amari, though young, had a power that could turn the tables in an instant. He wasn't just a child. He was a reminder that no matter how much money you have, respect cannot be bought. Amari sat quietly in his seat, still processing the events of the last few minutes. His mind was spinning, not from fear, but from the sudden realization of how much power his father, Lucius Johnson, held in the world. The sudden shift in the atmosphere on the plane was unmistakable. The other passengers, once oblivious to his presence, now seemed to watch him with a mix of curiosity and respect. They didn't know who he was, but they were beginning to sense that something had changed. The stewardess, Samantha Green, had been so quick to judge him, thinking him just another privileged child, deserving of her disdain. But as soon as the phone call had come, everything had shifted. Lucius's calm, authoritative voice on the other end of the line had been enough to bring the entire flight crew to their knees, metaphorically speaking. And Samantha, the one who had looked down on him, was now facing the consequences. She didn't know it, but she had just crossed the line with the wrong person. Amari had learned early in life that there was a difference between real power and the illusion of it. His father had shown him what it meant to command respect without ever having to raise his voice. It was a lesson that had shaped him into someone who could endure the mockery and snide remarks of those who thought they could belittle him. And now, in this moment, he understood that power wasn't about being loud or aggressive. It was about the quiet confidence that came from knowing your worth. Samantha had no idea who she had just slapped. She had no idea that a single mistake could cost her everything. As Amari sat there, He couldn't help but feel a sense of justice in the air. It wasn't that he was happy about what had happened to her, but there was something deeply satisfying about seeing someone who had so carelessly dismissed him now facing the consequences of her actions. The flight continued, but the atmosphere had shifted. It was no longer a routine trip. The weight of the situation lingered in the cabin, and Amari could feel the eyes of the passengers on him. They weren't looking at him with contempt anymore. They were looking at him with something else. Curiosity, respect, and maybe even a little fear. Samantha's trembling hands were now busy with the paperwork in front of her. She had been called to the back of the plane by her supervisor, and the look on her face said it all. She knew her job was on the line, and she couldn't help but replay her mistake over and over again in her mind. She had thought she was in control. She had thought her position gave her power. But now, in the silence of the back cabin, she realized just how wrong she had been. The real power had always been with Amari, even if he had never shown it. As the flight neared its destination, Amari could see the other flight attendants whispering among themselves. The once glamorous crew had lost their confidence, their arrogance replaced by fear. They had all witnessed how quickly things could change, how quickly someone could go from being in control to being completely powerless. When the plane landed, Amari was one of the first passengers to disembark. The staff, now visibly shaken, barely made eye contact with him as he walked past. He didn't hold any ill will towards them. They were simply part of a world he didn't need to engage with. But it was a lesson he would never forget. Power was not in the hands of those who flaunted it. It was in the hands of those who could remain calm, remain composed, and wait for the right moment to act. And for Amari, that moment was just beginning. The next day, Amari's life returned to its usual rhythm. The mansion was quieter without the usual bustle of staff, but there was an underlying tension in the air. His father, Lucius Johnson, was not the type to publicly show anger, but even he couldn't hide his irritation at the incident on the plane. Amari sat in the study, his attention split between the book in front of him and the conversation happening just outside the door. Lucius and his assistant, James, were discussing the situation in hushed tones. "She's fired, Lucius," James was saying. "The entire team is gone. No one touches your son, especially not like that." Amari could hear the sharpness in his father's voice. "I don't want to make a spectacle of it," Lucius replied. "But no one ever disrespects my family like that. I don't care how high up they are in their company." The conversation turned to logistics, but Amari was already lost in thought. He knew his father was just protecting him, but there was a part of him that felt uneasy. He didn't want to be treated like a symbol of his father's power. He wanted to be treated like a kid. The incident with Samantha and the flight crew had made him realize just how much people underestimated him. He wasn't some helpless child that needed protecting, and he didn't like the idea of his father going to such lengths for him. Amari wasn't one to stay silent, though. His father had taught him that silence didn't always equate to strength. So, when Lucius entered the room, Amari looked up from his book and met his father's gaze. "Dad," he said softly. Lucius raised an eyebrow, his expression a mixture of curiosity and concern. "What's up, son?" Amari hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "I know you fired them," he said. "But I don't want people to think I'm weak." Lucius was quiet for a moment, his sharp eyes studying his son. "Amari, no one thinks you're weak," he said, his tone softer now. "But you are my son, and no one disrespects you." Amari shook his head, not fully satisfied with the answer. "I get it, but I don't want to be treated like I can't handle things on my own. I want to stand up for myself." Lucius stood still for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I understand. But remember, son, power isn't about showing strength every time. Sometimes, it's about knowing when to act and when to let go. You have the power to make people respect you without raising a finger. Just remember that." Amari considered his father's words for a moment. He didn't completely agree, but he understood where his father was coming from. Lucius wasn't telling him to be passive. He was teaching him to choose his battles. As the day went on, the air in the mansion remained tense. Staff members were still wary, unsure of what would happen next. But Amari noticed that some things had changed. The way people looked at him had shifted. There was no longer the same dismissive glance when he entered a room. People now regarded him with more respect, though no one dared to voice their thoughts. Later that evening, Amari found himself in the garden, standing by the large oak tree that his father had planted years ago. It was his usual spot to think, to clear his mind. As he stood there, his thoughts wandered back to the flight and the events that followed. He wondered what Samantha was doing now, if she even realized the full extent of the consequences she had faced. Amari wasn't the type to hold grudges, but he couldn't deny the sense of justice that came with seeing someone like Samantha face the fallout of their actions. The world was unpredictable, but sometimes people got exactly what they deserved. And sometimes you didn't need to raise your voice to make sure the right thing happened. As Amari stood in the garden, watching the sky change from pink to deep purple, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. His father's words echoed in his mind. Power wasn't always about showing strength. It was about knowing when to act and when to let go. And in that moment, Amari understood that true power was about controlling the situation, not letting it control you. Amari sat in his room, staring out the window as the evening sun slowly set behind the towering city skyline. It had been a few days since the flight incident, but the aftermath still hung in the air. His father had made it clear that the people involved would face consequences, but Amari couldn't shake the feeling that something more was at play. He didn't want to be seen as someone who relied solely on his father's influence to get by. He wanted to make his own decisions, to prove that he could stand on his own. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on his door. "Come in," Amari called, not taking his eyes off the horizon. The door opened, and Lucius stepped inside. He was calm, as always, but there was a sense of seriousness about him. "How are you holding up?" Lucius asked, his voice low and gentle. Amari turned to face his father, unsure of how to answer. "I'm fine," he said, though he wasn't entirely sure if that was true. "But I don't want to be known for what you did, Dad. I want to be known for what I do." Lucius studied his son carefully before responding. "I understand, Amari. But sometimes, life doesn't give you the luxury of choosing how others see you. People will judge you, whether you like it or not. The key is how you handle it when it happens." Amari frowned slightly. "But I don't want to handle things by hiding behind your name, Dad. I want to be more than just your son. I want to do things for myself, to show people that I can make my own decisions." Lucius nodded slowly, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I know you do, and you will. But there are times when even the strongest person needs help. No one gets to where they are alone. I didn't, and neither will you." Amari thought about this for a moment. He knew his father was right, but it didn't sit well with him. He didn't want to rely on others, especially not on his father's influence. He wanted to carve his own path, to make his own way in the world. Lucius seemed to sense the inner turmoil brewing in his son. He placed a hand on Amari's shoulder and looked him in the eye. "Amari, no one is asking you to hide behind my name. But don't underestimate the power of experience. You'll learn that when the time comes. Until then, trust me, son, you'll have to learn to balance your own strength with the understanding that there are times when others will come through for you." Amari's mind was still racing, but he knew his father's words weren't just meant to reassure him. They were meant to teach him something more important: patience. Patience in himself and patience in others. It was a lesson that would take time for him to fully understand, but it was one he knew he would need as he grew older. As Lucius turned to leave the room, he paused at the door and glanced back at Amari. "Remember, son, power isn't about forcing your way through life. It's about knowing when to step forward and when to step back. You'll figure it out. Just give it time." Amari sat back in his chair, his thoughts still swirling. He didn't know if he was ready to follow in his father's footsteps, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let anyone define him by his father's name. He would make his own choices, even if it meant facing challenges along the way. The next few days were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and discussions about the fallout from the flight incident. But amidst the chaos, Amari felt a growing sense of resolve. He wasn't going to be just another rich kid living in his father's shadow. He would prove to the world, and to himself, that he was more than that. One day, people would look at Amari Johnson and see him for who he truly was, not just as the son of Lucius Johnson, but as a force to be reckoned with in his own right. Amari woke up to the sound of his phone buzzing on the nightstand. It was still early, the sun barely peeking over the horizon, casting a soft glow across the city. He had been up late thinking, his mind unable to stop racing since his conversation with his father. He felt a sense of urgency now. Something had shifted within him. He needed to make a decision, to step out of the shadow he had been living in for so long. Reaching for the phone, he glanced at the screen. It was a text from James, his father's assistant. Meeting at 10 a.m., the usual place. Don't be late. Amari didn't need to ask what the meeting was about. The fallout from the flight incident was still unfolding, and he knew his father had been working behind the scenes to make sure the consequences were felt. Amari didn't like how things were handled, though. It wasn't the kind of power he wanted to wield. He didn't want to be someone who used fear to get things done. But Lucius was different. Amari's father wasn't the type to show emotion, especially not in business. He took control quietly, behind closed doors, and he expected results. That's what made him who he was. But for Amari, the lessons of power were becoming more complicated. He had always respected his father, but he knew he couldn't follow the same path. He needed to find his own way, his own voice. He needed to prove to himself that he wasn't just another cog in the wheel of his father's empire. The thought lingered with him as he showered and dressed. He pulled on a simple black suit, more for comfort than for style. He didn't care about impressing anyone anymore. He was tired of people assuming that because of who his father was, he was destined for the same path. As he walked into the meeting, James greeted him with a nod and a quick handshake. The usual group was there, people who had been working for his father for years. But as Amari took his seat at the table, something felt different. He wasn't just a bystander in this meeting. This time, he was here to make decisions, to be part of the conversation. The discussion started with the usual updates, numbers, strategies, investments, but Amari couldn't focus on the details. His mind kept drifting back to the flight, to Samantha, to the power his father had used to destroy her career. He knew his father had done what needed to be done, but it didn't sit right with him. It was too easy. Amari, Lucius said, breaking his son's train of thought. What do you think about the latest investment proposal? You've been quiet today. The room fell silent, all eyes on Amari. He wasn't used to this level of attention, but he held his ground. It was time to speak up. I think it's a good investment, Amari said, his voice steady. But I also think we need to look at the long-term consequences. We can't just focus on short-term gains. We need to be more mindful of the people involved, the communities we're affecting. Lucius raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by his son's response. The room was still. Amari could feel the weight of his words. This wasn't about numbers or strategies. This was about what kind of legacy he wanted to build. I agree, Lucius said after a pause. But you must understand, Amari, that in business, you sometimes have to make tough choices. You won't always be able to please everyone. Amari nodded, but he knew there was more to it. It wasn't just about making tough choices. It was about how those choices affected the people around you. As the meeting continued, Amari found himself thinking less about the numbers on the board and more about the kind of man he wanted to become. He didn't want to be known for his father's empire, for the power that came with his name. He wanted to be known for his own decisions, for his ability to lead with integrity and compassion. When the meeting finally ended, Amari stood up, feeling a sense of resolve wash over him. He wasn't going to follow in his father's footsteps. He was going to carve out his own path, one where power wasn't just about control, but about doing the right thing, even when it was hard. As he left the room, James caught up with him. You did well in there, he said with a smile. I think your father is impressed. Amari didn't respond right away. He simply nodded, but inside, he knew something had shifted. This was only the beginning. Amari stood on the balcony of his family's penthouse, watching the city come to life as night fell. The lights below sparkled, creating a web of energy that seemed so far from the life he had just begun to understand. He had always been surrounded by luxury, but now, it felt different. The wealth, the power, it all seemed empty when you realized it didn't define who you were. It was the choices you made, the people you impacted, that shaped your identity. He had been thinking about the meeting earlier that day, the weight of his words, and the responsibility that came with them. It wasn't easy, stepping into a role where expectations were high, and where every move he made was watched by those who had worked with his father for years. Amari knew he had to earn their respect, not because of his name, but because of his actions. As he turned to go back inside, his phone buzzed. It was a message from his father's assistant, James. Lucius wants to meet with you tonight. 8 p.m., the usual spot. Amari didn't hesitate. He knew this wasn't just a casual meeting. His father had been keeping him in the loop more lately, and Amari could feel the shift in their relationship. Lucius wasn't just his father anymore. He was becoming a mentor, someone who was teaching him the ropes, but also giving him the space to find his own way. When Amari arrived at the restaurant, it was as quiet as ever. The staff recognized him immediately, but he wasn't here for the usual pleasantries. He was here to talk about something important. Lucius was already seated, his back straight, eyes focused on the glass of water in front of him. He looked up as Amari approached, a rare smile playing at the corners of his lips. "Sit down, son," Lucius said, his voice calm, but with an edge that suggested the conversation was about to get serious. Amari took his seat, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. There was a certain tension in the air, a weight that neither was willing to address directly. Finally, Lucius broke the silence. "I've been watching you, Amari," he began. "I've been watching how you've been handling things, your choices, your words, your actions. And I have to say, I'm impressed." Amari felt a wave of relief wash over him, but he didn't let it show. He wasn't here to seek approval. "I've been trying to do what feels right," Amari replied, his voice steady. "I want to make my own decisions. I don't want to rely on your name to get by." Lucius nodded, his gaze never leaving Amari's. "I know that, and I respect it. But I need you to understand something, Amari. The world is not as simple as it seems. There are times when you'll need to make choices that go against your principles. It's not about compromising who you are, it's about survival. You need to be prepared for that." Amari absorbed his father's words, but a part of him resisted. He didn't want to believe that success required sacrificing his integrity. He had seen too many people in his life who had done just that, who had chosen power over doing what was right. "I don't want to be like that," Amari said quietly. "I don't want to make decisions just because they're easy or because they protect my position." Lucius leaned forward, his expression softening. "I'm not telling you to abandon your principles, son. What I'm telling you is that sometimes the world will force your hand. And when that happens, you need to be ready. You need to be able to stand up and make the tough decisions, no matter how difficult they are." Amari thought about this, about how his father had navigated the world for years with an iron will. He had built an empire, sure, but at what cost? Was that the kind of man Amari wanted to be? Or was there another way, a way to balance power with integrity? As the night went on, they continued talking, discussing the intricacies of business, leadership, and the challenges that lay ahead. Amari listened more than he spoke, taking in everything his father had to say. Lucius wasn't trying to mold him into a mirror image of himself. He was trying to teach him how to navigate the complex world they lived in, how to rise above the chaos and still remain true to himself. As they left the restaurant, Amari felt a sense of resolve growing inside him. He didn't have all the answers yet, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let anyone define him by his father's name. He was going to make his own way, and he was going to do it with the strength and integrity that his father had taught him. The world might be complex, but Amari was ready for whatever came next. Amari woke up early the next morning, feeling a sense of clarity that he hadn't felt in a long time. The conversation with his father had left him thinking, questioning everything he thought he knew about power and leadership. His father had always been a force to be reckoned with, a man who could command a room with just a glance. But Lucius's words from last night echoed in Amari's mind. Power wasn't just about control. It was about knowing when to act and when to let go. Amari didn't know if he was ready for all that yet, but he was starting to understand. It was a slow realization that he couldn't ignore anymore. The world wasn't as simple as it seemed. And sometimes, doing the right thing meant standing up, even when the cost was high. He had spent his whole life thinking that if he stayed quiet and did what was expected of him, he would find peace. But peace didn't come with silence. It came with action. He got dressed in a simple suit, nothing too flashy, and grabbed his keys. He wasn't going to wait around anymore. He had to prove to himself that he was more than just Lucius Johnson's son. He was going to make his own path. The day was cloudy, the kind of weather that made everything feel a little heavier, a little more serious. As he drove to the office, Amari couldn't help but think about the meeting he had scheduled later in the day. It was with a potential investor, someone who could change everything for the company. But Amari didn't want to talk business the way his father did. He wanted to do things differently. He parked in the underground lot and walked up to the building. The lobby was bustling with people, employees walking quickly, some pausing to chat, others too busy to notice anyone else. It was the kind of energy Amari had always found intimidating. But today, he felt different. He wasn't going to let the weight of expectations crush him anymore. He was going to stand tall. He walked into the conference room where the investor was already waiting. The man stood up as Amari entered, his handshake firm but cold. "Mr. Johnson," the investor said, offering a polite smile. "I've heard a lot about you." Amari smiled back, but there was no warmth in it. He had learned early that pleasantries could mask the real intentions behind a deal. "I'm sure you have," Amari replied. "But today, I'm here to talk about more than just business. I want to talk about the future." The investor raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "The future?" "Yes," Amari said, taking a seat across from him. "Not just numbers and profits. The world is changing, and I want to make sure we're part of that change. We have the power to influence people, to create something meaningful. It's not just about making money. It's about making a difference." The investor leaned back in his chair, clearly not expecting such a bold approach. "I see," he said, pausing to consider Amari's words. "But how do you plan on doing that? You can't ignore the bottom line, Mr. Johnson. It's all about the numbers." Amari's gaze didn't falter. "I'm not ignoring the bottom line. I'm saying that we can do both. We can create something that's profitable and still make a positive impact. It's about thinking long-term, not just short-term gains." The investor seemed to weigh this for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I like your vision, Mr. Johnson. It's ambitious. But the question is, do you have the resources to back it up?" Amari smiled, this time with more confidence. "I have more than resources. I have conviction, and that's worth more than anything else." The investor stared at him for a long moment before finally speaking. "You're not like your father," he said, almost to himself. Amari leaned forward slightly. "I'm exactly like my father in some ways. But I'm also my own person. I'm here to create something that lasts, not just to maintain what's already been built." The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of Amari's words hanging in the air. The investor looked at him, as if seeing him for the first time, and nodded. "I'm intrigued, Mr. Johnson. Let's see where this goes." As Amari left the room, he felt a small but significant victory. He wasn't just following in his father's footsteps anymore. He was carving out his own path, one where his values and vision would guide him. It was only the beginning, but Amari knew one thing for sure. He was ready for whatever came next. Amari sat at his desk the next morning, the weight of the conversation from the day before still heavy on his mind. The meeting with the investor had gone well, but it wasn't just about securing a deal. It was about making a statement. He wasn't going to let himself be defined by the expectations that others had for him. He wanted to prove that he could lead on his own terms, with his own vision. His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a message from his father. "Come to the office. We need to talk." Amari didn't hesitate. He grabbed his jacket and left the room, heading for the elevator. As he walked through the familiar hallways of his father's office building, he could feel the eyes of the employees on him. They had always known him as Lucius Johnson's son, but lately, he had been doing things differently. He had been making decisions that felt more aligned with who he wanted to become, not just who people expected him to be. When he reached his father's office, the door was already open. Lucius was sitting at his desk, flipping through some papers, but he looked up when Amari walked in. "Close the door," Lucius said, his voice calm but firm. Amari did as he was told and took a seat across from his father. There was a brief silence before Lucius spoke again. "I've been hearing things," he said, his eyes locking onto Amari's. "About how you're handling things. About your approach to the business." Amari's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't sure what to expect next, but he didn't want to back down now. "What are you hearing?" Amari asked, keeping his voice steady. "People are talking," Lucius said, leaning back in his chair. "They're saying you're too idealistic, that you're focusing too much on the big picture and not enough on the numbers. Some are questioning if you have the stomach for this." Amari's eyes narrowed. He had expected his father to be more supportive, but he also knew that Lucius had always valued results over ideals. "I'm not here to make decisions just to please people," Amari said, his voice firm. "I'm here to make a difference. I want to build something that lasts, something that people will remember for the right reasons." Lucius didn't respond immediately. Instead, he studied his son, as if weighing his words carefully. "You think you're the first to want that?" Lucius finally asked. "You think I didn't want to build something that would last? Something meaningful?" "I did. But I also had to learn that sometimes the world doesn't care about your ideals. It cares about power, results, and how quickly you can make things happen." Amari listened to his father, the words sinking in deeper than he wanted them to. He had always admired Lucius's success, but now he was beginning to see the cost. The compromises, the decisions that had been made not for the greater good, but for survival. "I'm not saying I'm perfect," Lucius continued. "I've made mistakes. But I've built this empire, Amari. I've done what it takes to get here. And if you want to succeed, you'll have to do the same." Amari's mind raced as he absorbed his father's words. He had always known that success came with a price, but now he understood just how high that price could be. Was it worth it? Was the cost of his ideals too great to pursue? He didn't have the answers yet, but one thing was clear. He couldn't ignore the lessons his father had taught him. He would have to find a way to balance his vision with the reality of the world he lived in. "I'm not backing down, Dad," Amari said, his voice steady. "I know what I want to do, and I'll do whatever it takes to make it happen, even if it's not the easy way." Lucius nodded slowly, his gaze softening just a little. "I know you will," he said quietly. "But remember this, sometimes, doing things the right way means making sacrifices. It's not always about what's easy, but what's necessary." Amari sat there for a moment, contemplating his father's words. He wasn't sure if he agreed with everything Lucius had said, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't walk away from this. He couldn't let the world define him. He had to make his own choices, even if those choices were hard. As he left his father's office, Amari felt a sense of resolve settle within him. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was ready for it. He was ready to fight for his vision, no matter what. And he was ready to prove to himself and the world that he was more than just the son of Lucius Johnson. The following week, Amari found himself sitting in yet another meeting, this time with a group of investors who were intrigued by the vision he had shared during the last discussion. The tension in the air was palpable, the kind of quiet pressure that came when something important was about to unfold. He sat at the head of the table, his hands folded in front of him, trying to project calm, though inside, he was bracing himself. The stakes were higher than ever. The investors, all sharp-suited and calculating, were scanning him, sizing him up. The room was filled with the subtle hum of expectation. "Mr. Johnson," one of the investors began, his voice smooth and measured, "we've reviewed your proposal, and we're impressed. But we need to know, how do you plan to balance the idealism you've spoken about with the practicalities of running a successful business? The world doesn't always play by idealistic rules." Amari straightened in his chair, taking a deep breath. The question wasn't unexpected, but it still felt like the first real test of his resolve. "I'm aware of the challenges," Amari said confidently, his voice steady. "But I believe there's room for both. Yes, we need to be profitable, but we can't forget the impact we're making. We have the opportunity to lead with integrity, to be an example of what can be achieved when businesses prioritize people as much as profits." The room fell silent for a moment, the investors exchanging glances. Amari could feel the weight of their skepticism. "And how do you plan to get your team to follow you?" another investor asked. "Leadership is one thing, but getting others to buy in, especially in this kind of environment, is another." Amari thought for a moment, then leaned forward slightly, his gaze focused. "Leadership isn't about giving orders. It's about inspiring others to believe in the vision. If I'm asking people to take risks, to believe in a different way of doing things, I have to show them that I'm willing to do the same. I'm not asking anyone to follow me blindly. I'm asking them to believe in the possibility of something better." The investors seemed to pause, mulling over his words. Amari's heart raced, but he kept his expression calm. This wasn't just about making the sale. It was about proving to himself that he could walk this path, that he was capable of leading not just through his father's legacy, but through his own actions. "We like what we hear, Mr. Johnson," the first investor finally said, breaking the silence. "But this is a big commitment. We're willing to move forward, but we'll need you to prove that this approach can work on a larger scale." Amari nodded. "I understand. I'll prove it," he said, his voice filled with determination. "I'm ready for the challenge." As the meeting concluded, Amari walked out of the room with a sense of purpose that he hadn't felt in a long time. The deal wasn't done yet, but he had made the first step. He had shown the investors that he wasn't just some heir to a fortune. He was someone who believed in making a real difference. The world was waiting for him to act, and he was ready. Later that evening, Amari sat alone in his office, reflecting on everything that had happened over the past few weeks. His father's words about sacrifice and power still echoed in his mind. But now, he was beginning to see things differently. Power didn't have to mean control. It didn't have to mean sacrificing one's principles. It could mean influence, leadership, and the ability to inspire others to rise above their circumstances. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be challenges, and there would be setbacks. But Amari knew that he was on the right path. He wasn't just following in anyone's footsteps. He was creating his own legacy, one where his values and vision would guide him, not the expectations of others. As he turned off the light in his office and left for the night, Amari felt a quiet confidence settle within him. He was ready for whatever came next. He knew that he could handle the weight of leadership and that he could do it on his own terms.